The last call. Sarah worked as a night operator at a small call center in Chicago. The job was dull but steady, and she needed the money. Her shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. Usually, only she, another operator on a different line, and a security guard on the first floor remained in the building. She had grown used to the silence, the dim glow of the monitors, and the faint hum of the servers behind the walls. Night shifts were always the same. Sometimes she struggled to stay awake, drowning herself in coffee from the vending machine. Other times she entertained herself by reading the city news. But that night something felt different. The air in the office was heavy, thick, like before a storm. Then the phone rang. Sarah glanced at the screen. 2:13 a.m. A strange time for a call. Usually clients called in the evening or early morning. She mechanically picked up and spoke her usual line. "Good evening, how can I help you?" For a few seconds there was only silence. Then she heard breathing. Long, slow, as if the caller was trying not to be heard. "Are you alone in the building?" Sarah tensed. This wasn't a normal client. "I'm sorry, but I can't disclose that information. Do you need assistance?" Another pause. Then the voice, quieter this time, almost a whisper, as if the person was in the same room as her. "I'm already inside." A chill ran down her spine. She quickly looked around. The office was empty, the same as always. 2 rows of desks, computers, dim overhead lights. She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Maybe this was just a stupid prank, but something felt wrong. Trying to maintain her composure, she opened the security camera feed. The first camera showed the entrance, empty. The second, an empty hallway leading to the server room. The third, the server room. In the far corner stood a man. He was barely visible in the shadows, but his silhouette was clear. He wasn't moving, wasn't trying to hide. He was just standing there, head slightly tilted, staring directly at the camera. Sarah's fingers went numb. She grabbed the phone and dialed the security office. The ringing seemed to go on forever. No answer. Then suddenly a message appeared on her screen. It wasn't an email. It wasn't a chat notification. It just appeared. "Why are you calling? It won't help." Her stomach tightened with fear. He knew what she was doing. He was watching her. Her throat was dry, but she forced her fingers to type a response. "Who are you?" The reply came instantly. "Your way out is through the back door. If you run now, you have a chance." Sarah swallowed hard. Was this a game or a warning? A sound echoed down the hallway. Footsteps. Slow, heavy. Her body turned ice cold. Her heart pounded, but her mind screamed, "Run." She rose from her chair carefully, trying not to make a sound, and stepped toward the door. She opened it slowly. The hallway was empty. The shadows in the corners seemed darker than usual. Far ahead, the back exit was visible. It was her only chance, but just as she took a step forward, she heard something behind her, a quiet exhale, almost against her ear. She froze. Then, footsteps, loud, heavy. She turned. A man stood a few feet away. Tall, thin, dressed in dark clothing. His face was partially hidden in the shadows, but his smile was clearly visible. A knife gleamed in his hand. "You almost made it," he whispered. Sarah screamed and ran for the door. She grabbed the handle. Locked. The footsteps behind her quickened. She banged on the door frantically until suddenly a loud crash came from the other side. The door burst open, and police officers stormed in. The man was tackled to the ground, but he never stopped smiling as they dragged him away. Later, Sarah learned that he was a serial killer who had been stalking women working night shifts for months. 3 women had vanished before her. She was the only one who made it out. After that night, Sarah quit her job and left the city. She stopped answering calls from unknown numbers, but sometimes exactly at 2:13 a.m., her phone still rang, and on the other end there was only breathing. Whispers in the walls. Daniel and Emily had always dreamed of living in a quiet, secluded home away from the bustle of city life. After months of searching, they finally found the perfect place. An old Victorian house nestled in the woods of upstate New York. The house was large, with tall windows and ivy creeping up its brick facade. The trees around it were ancient, and the whole place felt like something out of a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The price was incredibly low, far below what they expected for a house of that size and character. But the realtor assured them that it was just a deal they couldn't pass up. "Some things just happen that way," she said with a strange smile, before disappearing into the night. From the moment they stepped through the front door, Daniel and Emily felt a sense of unease, but they dismissed it as nothing more than the natural nerves of moving into a new home. The house creaked and groaned as if it were settling into its foundations, and the walls seemed to hum with the faintest whisper of something hidden beneath the surface. The first night was peaceful, almost perfect. They drank wine by the fire, unpacked their belongings, and wandered the rooms. The house felt like it was holding on to memories, its walls thick with the past. In the attic, they found dusty old furniture and forgotten trinkets that spoke of another time. They laughed, unbothered by the way the shadows stretched a little too long and the air felt a little too still. But then, as midnight struck, Emily heard the first whisper. It was soft at first, barely audible. At first, she thought it was the wind, or perhaps the house settling, but it was so distinct, so clear. "Emily." She froze. The voice came from nowhere. No one was there. She stood motionless, her breath catching in her throat. The whispering was so faint, like a murmur hidden deep within the walls. She shook her head, thinking it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The next night, the whispering returned, this time louder. She lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, the whispers echoing through the darkness. The sound seemed to come from the walls, the floors, as if the house itself were trying to communicate with her. She got up and walked into the hallway, hoping it was just the wind, but the hallway was silent. She checked the windows, the doors. Everything was locked and secure. The whispering had stopped the moment she stepped into the hall, but the unease remained. She didn't mention it to Daniel, afraid he might think she was imagining things. But as the days passed, the whispers became more frequent, more persistent. She began to feel a presence in the house, a feeling that something was watching her from the corners of the rooms, from within the walls. Then came the tapping. It started as a faint rhythmic knock from inside the walls. It wasn't like the house settling or the wind pushing against the structure. It was something deliberate, as if something, or someone, was trying to get her attention. The taps would come at night, just as she was about to drift off to sleep. They'd start slow, then grow louder and faster until they stopped abruptly. One night, the tapping turned into scratching. Emily had gone to bed exhausted, hoping that a good night's sleep would rid her of the strange feelings that had been creeping over her. But as she lay there, the scratching sound began, almost like claws dragging across the wood, faint at first, then growing louder and more frantic. She got up again, convinced that something was wrong. She pressed her ear to the bedroom wall, her heart racing. The sound stopped the moment she did, leaving her in silence. But the silence was worse. Then, right next to her ear, she heard it. A voice, so close it felt like the breath on her skin. "Let me out." Emily screamed and stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. She woke Daniel, but when they checked the room, there was nothing. No signs of an intruder, no explanation. Daniel chalked it up to stress, to the overwhelming change of moving into a new house. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling. Something was wrong. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. The whispers, the tapping, the feeling of being watched, it was all too much. The next night, Daniel decided he would stay awake, hoping to disprove Emily's fears. He sat up in bed, staring into the dark, every muscle tense. For hours, he heard nothing. The house was quiet, the only sound being the occasional creak of old wood. Then, at exactly 3:13 a.m., it started. The scratching. It was coming from inside the walls, but it wasn't the same as before. This time it was louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to claw its way out. Daniel's blood ran cold. He listened, straining to hear more, but then came the whispers. Not from the walls. They were in the room. "Daniel," the voice rasped. It sounded faint, but it was there, right behind him. His skin crawled. The bed creaked as if someone had sat down at the foot of it. The temperature in the room dropped, and his breath formed mist in the air. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. He felt a cold hand brush his shoulder. He froze, unable to move. Then the voice came again, this time a rasping whisper in his ear. "You shouldn't be here." With all the strength in his body, Daniel jumped out of bed, his heart pounding in his chest. Emily awoke, terrified, and they fled from the room. The next day, Daniel decided they had to get to the bottom of this. He couldn't explain the sounds, the whispers, the feeling of something lurking within the walls. Together they investigated the house, looking for any sign of the source of their terror. In the attic, they found an old, faded photograph of a family standing in front of the house, smiling, happy, but there was something strange about it. The faces of the parents were scratched out, and the child in the picture was covered in a strange black ink. The more they searched, the more they uncovered. Hidden beneath the floorboards in one of the bedrooms, Daniel found something that made his stomach turn. Tiny bones. A child's bones, buried deep in the walls of the house, as if hidden, as if someone had tried to erase their existence. The whispers grew louder. They filled the house, echoing through the halls. The walls seemed to tremble, and the scratching was back. This time, more frantic, more desperate. Emily screamed as she realized what they had found. The bones were the remains of a child, someone who had been locked away, forgotten in the walls of this house. And now, the whispers were calling out for revenge. That night, the air turned frigid. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. They could hear the child's laughter, low, mocking, as if it was everywhere and nowhere at once. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness. The scratching stopped. The whispers faded. But something else had taken its place. The sound of soft, tiny footsteps echoed from the hallway. Emily and Daniel froze, unable to move. Then a voice, soft, sweet, and childlike, whispered through the darkness, "Let me out." But this time it was no longer in the walls. It was right behind them. The Hunters of Hollow Creek. Hollow Creek Forest was known for its eerie stillness. The locals avoided it, especially after dusk. Whispers circulated about strange happenings, about disappearances, and mysterious sounds that echoed through the trees at night. But for the group of seasoned hunters, Jack, Sam, and Kyle, it was the perfect place for their annual hunting trip. They'd heard the stories, but they were practical men, grounded in reality. Nothing would scare them. They arrived on a crisp autumn morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. The forest seemed almost too quiet, too still, as if it were holding its breath. Despite the unsettling feeling that crept over them, the men brushed it off, eager to begin their hunt. They set up camp at the edge of the woods, their rifles slung over their shoulders, ready for a few days of hunting deer and enjoying the solitude of the wild. But the first night, as they sat around the fire, things began to feel off. They joked and laughed, drinking beer, but the forest around them felt like it was closing in. The trees loomed over them, their skeletal branches reaching toward the sky. The shadows cast by the fire flickered strangely, almost as if something was moving just outside the light. Jack, the most superstitious of the group, mentioned the stories he had heard from the locals. He spoke of hunters who had gone into Hollow Creek and never returned, of eerie figures seen in the distance, always just out of reach. Sam laughed it off, but Kyle, usually the quiet one, seemed to grow uneasy. Around midnight, they decided to head to bed. Jack, uneasy, kept the fire going longer than usual, staring into the dark woods. The others didn't seem to notice, but Jack swore he saw movement, shadows shifting in the trees, shapes moving silently through the night. The next morning, Jack woke up to find Kyle gone. It wasn't like Kyle to wander off without saying anything, especially not in the early morning, when the sun had barely risen. Sam, still groggy from sleep, muttered something about it being no big deal. Kyle was probably just out getting water or taking a walk, but Jack's gut told him something was wrong. They searched the area around the camp, calling out for their friend, but there was no sign of him, not even his tracks in the soft morning dirt. The air grew colder as the day dragged on, and the feeling of being watched never left. Jack couldn't shake the sense that something was lurking just beyond the trees, hidden in the dark corners of the forest. By late afternoon, they found Kyle's rifle, abandoned at the base of a large oak tree, its barrel pointed toward the ground. His jacket was next to it, carefully laid out as if someone had taken it off for him. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, just the eerie feeling of something unnatural. Jack insisted they leave immediately, but Sam, more practical, argued that they should search further. He refused to believe that Kyle had been taken by anything but the wilderness. Reluctantly, Jack agreed, and they continued their search. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to grow taller and the shadows darker. The forest felt alive in a way that made their skin crawl. Every rustle in the underbrush made their hearts race, and every snap of a twig made them jump. Then, as dusk fell, they stumbled upon something that made their blood run cold. It was a clearing, hidden deep within the forest, and in the center of the clearing stood a massive stone circle, ancient weathered stones arranged in a perfect ring. Inside the circle, the ground was disturbed, as though something, or someone, had been dragged across it. And in the center, there were marks on the earth, strange symbols carved into the dirt. Jack felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. He couldn't explain why, but the sight of the stone circle filled him with an overwhelming sense of dread. As they stood there, trying to make sense of what they were looking at, they heard something, soft at first, then louder. Whispers. Voices, low and murmuring, carried on the wind. They came from every direction, surrounding them, but when they turned to look, there was no one there. Jack's instinct screamed at him to leave, but Sam, more curious than afraid, stepped into the stone circle, examining the strange symbols etched into the ground. That was when the air shifted. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by a low, guttural growl. The earth beneath their feet seemed to tremble, and the trees around the clearing groaned as if something ancient had awakened. The temperature dropped so rapidly that Jack could see his breath in the air. Suddenly, a shape darted through the trees. It was fast, too fast, and it moved with an unnatural grace. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he grabbed his rifle, but before he could even raise it, the figure emerged from the shadows. It was Kyle. But it wasn't Kyle. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his skin was pale, almost gray. His mouth was open in a silent scream, but no sound came out. His body was twisted, as though something had taken control of him, forcing him to move in ways that were unnatural. His arms hung limply by his sides, and his legs moved in an erratic, jerking motion, like a marionette on broken strings. Before Jack could react, Kyle's body fell to the ground with a sickening thud. And then, from the darkness, they came. Shadows. Figures. Creatures that should not have existed. Their forms shifting and changing, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They moved in a blur so fast that Jack and Sam barely had time to react. A pair of clawed hands grabbed Jack by the throat, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. Sam screamed, firing his rifle into the darkness, but the bullet seemed to have no effect. The creatures circled them, their eyes locked on their prey, as if savoring the fear that poured from them. Jack could barely breathe, his vision fading as the creature's grip tightened. His rifle fell to the ground with a dull thud, useless against the unnatural force holding him. Sam stumbled backward, but the creatures were too fast. One of them lunged at him, knocking him to the ground. Sam's scream echoed through the forest, but it was quickly cut off, swallowed by the darkness. The last thing Jack saw before everything went black was the figure of Kyle, standing among the shadows, his mouth stretched in a grotesque, silent grin. The next morning, the forest was eerily quiet. The only sign of the hunters' presence was their abandoned camp, the fire long since extinguished. The people of the nearby town had heard the stories, but no one dared to venture into Hollow Creek Forest. The hunters were never found. Some say they were taken by the creatures of the forest. Others say the forest itself claimed them. But one thing was certain. The whispers still echoed through the trees. And if you listen closely enough, you can hear them calling for more. The Child Thief of Briarwood. Briarwood was a quiet town tucked away in the hills, far from the city's noise and bustle. People had always felt safe here. It was a place where everyone knew each other, where neighbors looked out for one another, and where children played freely in the streets without fear. But all that changed one cold autumn night, when a dark figure arrived in Briarwood. The first disappearance happened on a crisp Friday evening. Little Emma, no older than 6, had been playing in the yard, chasing after a ball that had rolled into the bushes. Her mother, Sarah, had been in the kitchen, preparing dinner, the faint sound of the ball bouncing against the wooden fence the only thing she could hear. But when Sarah stepped outside to call Emma in for supper, the yard was eerily quiet. Emma was gone. No screams, no signs of a struggle. Just an empty yard. Panicked, Sarah ran through the house, searching every room, every corner, but there was no trace of her daughter. She called the police, and within minutes a search party formed. They combed the woods surrounding the town, questioned neighbors, and posted flyers with Emma's picture on every telephone pole, but there was no sign of her. It was as if the earth had swallowed her whole. The search continued for days, but no one had any answers. The only clue was a single shoe found in the dirt, just a few feet from where Emma had been playing. It was clean, undamaged, as if she had simply disappeared in the blink of an eye. Then, as the days turned to weeks, something strange began to happen. Other children started to vanish. It was always the same. On dark, quiet evenings, children would go missing without a sound. No one saw anything, heard anything, or found any sign of struggle. The children were simply gone. First, it was Emma. Then, little Lily, the shy girl who loved to read. Then Jacob, the curious boy who would explore every nook and cranny of Briarwood. Each disappearance seemed to follow the same pattern. Always at dusk, always without a trace. Parents locked their doors at night, kept their children close, but nothing seemed to stop the thief who was taking them. The town fell into a deep, anxious silence. Fear spread like wildfire, and whispers of something evil began to surface. Some spoke of a figure, a tall, shadowy man who had been seen lurking around the woods, his face hidden by a cloak. Others claimed it was no man at all, but a creature that fed on children. But no one knew for sure. The rumors became louder with each passing night. People said they had heard strange noises, like children's laughter, coming from deep within the woods after dark. Some claimed they had seen lights flickering in the trees, or heard soft whispers calling the names of the missing children. It was as if the forest itself was alive, hiding secrets too dark to understand. But it wasn't until the disappearance of 10-year-old Emily that the truth began to reveal itself. Emily had always been an independent girl, never one to stray far from home. But one night she wandered into the woods, chasing after a stray dog. Her parents thought nothing of it at first, but when hours passed and she didn't return, their worry turned to panic. The search began immediately, but this time, something was different. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, and the ground seemed to shift beneath their feet. The whispers were louder now, more distinct. It was as if something was beckoning them forward, urging them to go deeper. The farther they walked, the more it felt like they were being watched. Then, they found it, the clearing. In the middle of the forest stood a tall, ancient tree, its gnarled branches reaching up to the sky like twisted fingers. Beneath the tree, the earth was disturbed, as if something had been buried there. And there, scattered across the ground, were the belongings of the missing children: shoes, toys, stuffed animals, each item placed carefully, as though they were trophies. At the base of the tree, in the dirt, were strange markings, symbols that no one could recognize. It was then that the truth hit them. The children weren't just disappearing. They were being taken by something that had lived in these woods long before Briarwood was even founded. One of the searchers, a local historian named Harold, recognized the symbols. He had heard the old stories passed down by the town's first settlers, stories about an ancient evil that lived deep within the woods. They spoke of a creature, half human, half shadow, that would come when the leaves began to turn and the days grew short. It was a thief of children, a being that would steal them away to feed its insatiable hunger. The creature's name was the Shadow Man. The legend told of a pact made long ago, a pact between the settlers and the creature that lived in the forest. In exchange for their land and safety, the settlers had promised to offer up one child each year. If the pact was broken, if the creature was ever denied, it would come for every child in Briarwood. Harold's voice shook as he explained the story, but no one believed him, not until they saw it. That night, when the moon hung high in the sky, and the forest was covered in an unnatural stillness, the Shadow Man came. He was tall, towering above the trees, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. His eyes glowed with an eerie yellow light, and his hands were long, skeletal, reaching for the children of Briarwood. He moved silently, like a wisp of smoke, his footsteps barely touching the ground. And when he spoke, his voice was soft and coaxing, like a lullaby. "Come to me, children. Come, and I will give you rest." At first, the children were drawn to him, mesmerized by his voice. They followed him into the woods one by one, their parents unable to stop them. The Shadow Man took them all: Emma, Lily, Jacob, Emily, and every other child who had disappeared. They were never seen again. The town of Briarwood was left in ruins. The adults who remained could do nothing but mourn their lost children, their hearts heavy with the guilt of having failed them. The forest, once a peaceful place, became a cursed land, feared by all who dared to approach it. Some say the Shadow Man still walks the woods, waiting for the next child to come too close, his whispers calling in the night. And others believe the children are still out there, lost in the depths of the forest, their spirits trapped forever, waiting for someone to remember them. But the truth remains. No one dares to enter Briarwood anymore, and no one dares to speak of the child thief who still lurks in the shadows, claiming the souls of the innocent. The Ghost of Black Hollow House. There was a house on the outskirts of the small town of Black Hollow, a house that no one dared to approach. It had stood empty for decades, its windows dark, its doors always closed. The locals whispered about the house, the Black Hollow House, telling stories of strange lights flickering in the windows at night, of soft whispers carried by the wind, and of people who had gone inside, only to never return. The house had once belonged to the Worthington family. They had been a wealthy family, known for their lavish parties and grand estate. But one night, everything changed. A fire broke out in the middle of a celebration, consuming the house in flames. The fire claimed the lives of Mr. and Mrs. Worthington, along with their 2 young children. The townspeople said it was an accident, but rumors swirled. Some claimed the fire had been set on purpose, that the family's wealth and secrets had been buried in those flames. No one knew for sure what happened that night. But after the fire, the house stood abandoned, its charred remains untouched by time. It became a place of legend, a place where the living feared to go and the dead never seemed to leave. One autumn evening, a group of curious teenagers decided they were going to explore Black Hollow House. They had heard the stories, of course, but they were skeptical. Ghosts, they thought, were nothing but stories told to scare children. They were eager to prove that the house was just that, a house. There were 4 of them. Adam, the leader of the group, Sarah, his girlfriend, Ben, the prankster, and Lily, who was afraid of just about everything. They packed flashlights, snacks, and their phones, determined to spend the night inside the house, filming their adventure for everyone to see. When they arrived at the house, the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. The sky was overcast, casting an eerie gray light over the crumbling building. The windows were black, like hollow eyes staring into the void. Despite the chill in the air, the group pressed on, laughing nervously as they made their way through the overgrown yard. The front door creaked as Adam pushed it open. The air inside was stale, as if it had been sealed off from the world for decades. The floors groaned under their feet, and the walls were covered in soot and ash. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by their presence, as if the house itself was awakening from a long, troubled sleep. At first, they were just excited, exploring the rooms, joking about the strange creaks and groans of the house. Ben insisted on trying to scare everyone, sneaking up behind Sarah and tapping her shoulder, making her jump. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. The further they ventured into the house, the more oppressive it became. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the silence was so thick that it felt suffocating. Adam suggested they head upstairs, and reluctantly the others agreed. As they climbed the old staircase, the floorboards creaked with every step, their echoes filling the empty house. At the top of the stairs, they found a long hallway. The walls were covered with peeling wallpaper, and the doors to the rooms were all ajar, dark shadows lurking behind them. But it was the last door, at the end of the hall, that caught their attention. It was the door to what had once been the Worthingtons' bedroom. The door was shut, but there was something unsettling about it. The air around it seemed to vibrate, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible humming sound coming from the other side. Adam, with his usual bravado, pushed the door open. Inside, the room was colder than the rest of the house. The furniture was still there, though covered in dust and cobwebs. A large 4-poster bed sat in the center of the room, its once ornate headboard now blackened by smoke. But it was the mirror above the fireplace that caught their attention. It was old, cracked, and distorted, its surface reflecting the room in twisted, unnatural ways. Suddenly, the air grew thick, and the humming sound grew louder. A chill ran down their spines, and Lily, who had been silent until now, whispered, "Do you feel that? Something's wrong here." Before anyone could respond, the door slammed shut behind them, locking them inside. The room plunged into darkness, and their flashlights flickered out. Panic set in as the humming grew louder, more insistent. Adam tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. That's when they heard it. Soft footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the far corner of the room. At first, they thought it was one of them, moving in the dark, but the footsteps didn't match their own. They were heavier, more deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth in the darkness. Ben, terrified, called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" His voice trembled. There was no response, but the footsteps continued, drawing closer, until they stopped right behind them. Suddenly, the air was filled with a cold, rancid stench, like burnt flesh and decay. The temperature dropped so quickly that they could see their breath. Lily screamed, clutching Adam's arm, as a whisper, so faint, yet so clear, filled the room. "Get out. Get out." The voice was a low, raspy whisper, as if it were coming from the walls themselves. The room began to shake, the walls groaning, and the floor beneath them buckled. The mirror above the fireplace began to glow faintly, its cracked surface starting to ripple like water. It was then that they saw it, a shadow in the corner of the room, a figure standing just outside the range of their flashlights. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body blackened, its form shifting like smoke. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed a deep, fiery red. It was staring at them, its presence filling the room with a sense of dread that made their hearts pound in their chests. The footsteps began again, this time moving toward them. The figure was closing in. With one final, desperate effort, Adam slammed his shoulder into the door. The door gave way, and the group scrambled out, tumbling into the hallway. But as they fled down the stairs, they could still hear the footsteps, the humming, the whispering voice calling after them. They didn't stop running until they reached the safety of the town. They didn't look back, too terrified to even breathe properly. The next day, when the police were called to investigate, they found the house just as they had left it, silent, cold, and empty. But when they went into the room where the teens had been, they found something that wasn't there before. A new, fresh set of footprints, small, childlike, leading to the mirror. And on the mirror's cracked surface, written in something dark and viscous, were the words, "You should have never come." From that day on, no one dared to step foot in Black Hollow House. Some say the spirits of the Worthington family still haunt the place, unable to rest after the fire. Others believe the house itself is alive, hungry for the souls of those who enter its walls. Whatever the truth, the house stands empty, waiting for the next person foolish enough to disturb its dark peace.
Sweet dreams. I'm waiting for you in the next videos. Thank you.